The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a tornado touches down. Everyone's eyes were glued to the man in the defendant's chair, Sergeant Vance Whitaker. He wasn't trembling. He was smiling, a cold, predatory smile directed at the man on the bench, Judge Harlan Crowe. No one saw the movement until it was too late. The click of a safety disengaging echoed like a gunshot. In a heartbeat, the trial of the century turned into a hostage situation. But what Judge Crowe did next didn't just save lives. It exposed a secret that would shatter the entire police department. The heat in the county of Oak Haven was a physical weight. It pressed against the windows of the grand limestone courthouse, a relic of a different century trying to hold court in a modern world. Inside courtroom 4B, the air conditioning rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the humidity and the body heat of 300 spectators packed into the gallery. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Sitting at the defense table was Sergeant Vance Whitaker. To the citizens of Oak Haven's affluent north side, Whitaker was a hero, a decorated veteran of the force with decades of service, a man who kept the streets clean. To the residents of the south side, and particularly the minority communities he patrolled, Vance Whitaker was a monster. He was the ghost of the ninth, a man who operated with impunity, turning off body cameras and losing evidence whenever it suited him. He looked every bit of the part of the old guard, square-jawed with a buzz cut that had turned steel gray and eyes that looked like chips of flint. He sat with a rigid posture, his hands clasped on the mahogany table, showing no remorse, no fear. He wore his dress uniform, the medals gleaming on his chest, a psychological tactic suggested by his high-priced defense attorney, Quentin Falk. Falk was a shark in a three-piece suit. He leaned over to Whitaker, whispering something that made the corner of the officer's mouth twitch. They were confident. In Oak Haven, cops didn't go to jail, especially not cops like Vance Whitaker. But the variable they hadn't accounted for sat high above them behind the elevated bench. Judge Harlan Crowe was the first black judge appointed to the Superior Court in the county's history. He was a striking figure, broad-shouldered and bald, with wire-rimmed glasses that hid eyes known for their piercing intellect. Crowe wasn't part of the good old boy system. He was a former federal prosecutor who had moved back south to take care of his ailing mother. He had no debts to the local police union, no golf buddies in the DA's office. He was an island of stone in a sea of corruption. The charge was attempted murder in the first degree, coupled with aggravated assault in violation of oath. The victim was Jalen Brooks, a 17-year-old honor student who had been driving his grandmother's car to church choir practice. Whitaker had pulled him over for a broken taillight, a taillight that forensics later proved was smashed after the stop. The encounter had ended with Jalen in a coma, beaten within an inch of his life, and Whitaker claiming the boy had reached for a weapon. No weapon was ever found. The tension in the room was palpable. The gallery was segregated by ideology, if not by law. On the left, the police union representatives and Whitaker supporters wearing "Back the Blue" pins. On the right, Jalen's family weeping quietly, supported by community activists. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Raymond Voss, who had worked with Whitaker years ago, looked nervous. He kept shifting his weight, his hand hovering near his belt. He knew Whitaker. He knew what the man was capable of. "All rise!" Voss's voice cracked slightly. Judge Crowe entered from his chambers. The rustle of his robe was the only sound. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked straight at Vance Whitaker. And for the first time in decades, Whitaker felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was hatred, pure, unadulterated hatred for the man who dared to judge him. "Be seated," Crowe said, his voice a deep baritone that reached the back of the room without a microphone. "Docket number 44-902, the People versus Vance Whitaker. We are here for opening statements." Whitaker leaned back, chewing a piece of gum. He watched the judge's hands. Soft hands, Whitaker thought. Hands that haven't held a nightstick, hands that haven't strangled the life out of a problem. He was wrong. Prosecutor Nadia Reese stood up. She was young, barely 30, with a reputation for being tenacious. She had to be. The district attorney had assigned her this case, expecting her to fail. It was a sacrificial lamb assignment. If she lost, the DA could shrug and say they tried. If she won, well, nobody expected her to win. Nadia walked to the center of the well, her heels clicking on the parquet floor. She didn't use notes. She looked directly at the jury, a mix of 12 tired citizens who just wanted to go home. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nadia began, her voice steady, "on the night in question, Jalen Brooks did everything right. He pulled over. He kept his hands on the wheel. He said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir." He did everything we tell our children to do to survive a traffic stop. She paused, letting the image sink in. Sergeant Whitaker, she gestured to the defendant, did everything wrong. He escalated. He antagonized. And when he didn't get the reaction he wanted, when Jalen didn't give him a reason to be violent, Sergeant Whitaker created one. She walked over to the exhibit table and picked up a heavy metal flashlight, the standard issue maglite. "This isn't just a tool to see in the dark," she said, weighing it in her hand. In the hands of Vance Whitaker, this was a gavel. He decided the verdict, and he delivered the sentence right there on the side of the highway. He cracked Jalen's skull because he didn't like the way the boy looked at him. At the defense table, Whitaker scoffed audibly. Judge Crowe's eyes snapped to him. "Is something funny, Mr. Whitaker?" Crowe asked. The tone was mild, but the underlying threat was clear. Falk shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. My client is merely reacting to the theatrical nature of the prosecution's opening." "Overruled," Crowe said, never taking his eyes off Whitaker. "Keep your reactions to yourself, defendant. This is a courtroom, not a precinct locker room." Whitaker held the stare for a second too long before looking away. "You'll get yours," he thought. "Just wait." Nadia Reese continued painting a picture of a rogue cop who had terrorized the county for decades. She brought up the statistics. Dozens of excessive force complaints, all dismissed by internal affairs. She promised to show that this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Then it was Quentin Falk's turn. Falk was smooth. He buttoned his jacket and smiled at the jury like an old friend. "The prosecution tells a good story," Falk said, chuckling. "A scary story. But we aren't here for stories. We are here for facts. And the fact is, being a police officer is the hardest job in the world. You have split seconds to make life or death decisions." He walked behind Whitaker, placing a hand on the officer's shoulder. "Sergeant Whitaker is a hero. He has saved lives. He has delivered babies. He has taken bullets. On the night in question, he saw a movement, a shadow, a threat. He acted to protect the community. Now they want to put him in a cage for doing his job. They want to sacrifice him on the altar of political correctness." Falk lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't let them make you a pawn in their game. Send Vance Whitaker home to his family." The opening statement set the stage, but the real drama began when the prosecution called a surprise witness. It wasn't a forensic expert. It wasn't a bystander. "The people call Officer Bryce Nolan to the stand," Nadia announced. A murmur ripped through the courtroom. Bryce Nolan was Whitaker's rookie partner on the night of the incident. The blue wall of silence was legendary. Cops didn't rat on cops. It was the unwritten rule. For Nolan to testify against a senior officer, it was suicide. The doors opened and a young man in a frantic, ill-fitting suit walked in. He looked terrified. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding Whitaker at all costs. Whitaker went rigid, his knuckles turned white. He whispered something to Falk, his face contorting into a mask of fury. As Nolan took the oath, Whitaker made a hand gesture, a subtle one. He drew a line across his throat with his finger. Judge Crowe saw it. "Jury will be disregarded," Crowe slammed his gavel. "Bailiff, escort the jury out now." Once the jury was gone, Crowe leaned over the bench, his face thunderous. "Mr. Falk, control your client. If I see him threaten a witness again, I will revoke his bail and have him shackled to that chair. Do you understand me?" "I didn't do anything," Whitaker growled, his voice gravelly and defiant. "The kid is lying. He's weak." "I'm not asking you," Crowe said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm telling you. You are not on the street anymore, Whitaker. You are in my house, and in my house you follow the law." Whitaker stood up, ignoring his lawyer's hand tugging at his sleeve. He was tall, imposing. "Your house?" Whitaker sneered. "I built the foundation of this city with blood and sweat while you were reading books in a fancy law school, boy." The racial epithet hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. The court reporter gasped. Nadia Reese stood with her mouth open. Crowe didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Voss," Crowe said to the bailiff, "remand the defendant into custody. Bail is revoked. He spends the recess in the holding cell." Whitaker looked at the bailiff. Raymond Voss hesitated. It was a split second of hesitation, but it spoke volumes. Voss was afraid of Whitaker. "Raymond," Whitaker said softly, "you don't want to do that." "Do your job, deputy," Crowe commanded. Voss stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. Whitaker let out a short, sharp laugh. He allowed himself to be cuffed, but as he was led past the witness stand, He locked eyes with the terrified rookie Nolan. "Tick-tock, Bryce," Whitaker whispered. "Tick-tock." The courtroom doors closed behind him, but the atmosphere remained electric. Everyone knew this was far from over. Whitaker wasn't defeated. He was just getting started. And he had a plan that no one, not even the brilliant Judge Crowe, could foresee. When court reconvened, the air was thick enough to choke on. Vance Whitaker was brought back in, his wrists red from the handcuffs, but his demeanor hadn't cracked. If anything, the time in the holding cell seemed to have sharpened him. He sat down, shooting a look at Officer Bryce Nolan that would have stopped a lesser man's heart. But Nolan was already broken. He sat in the witness box looking like a ghost. "Officer Nolan," Nadia Reese asked, stepping close to the witness stand. "You were riding with Sergeant Whitaker on the night in question. Tell the jury what happened after the stop." Nolan swallowed hard. We pulled him over. The taillight was fine. I saw it. It was working when we were behind him." "Objection," Falk barked. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Crowe ruled. "Stick to what you observed after the stop." Nolan took a shaky breath. Whitaker approached the window. He was already angry. He'd been complaining all shift about affirmative action hires and how the neighborhood was going to hell. He dragged the boy out. Jalen didn't resist. He was crying. A sob broke out from Jalen's mother in the front row. "Then what?" Nadia pressed. Whitaker hit him with the flashlight. Once, twice, maybe 5 times. I screamed at him to stop. I tried to pull him off. Nolan wiped his eyes. Whitaker shoved me back. He said, "Learn your place, rookie. This is how we keep the animals in the zoo." The racial slur spoken into the microphone echoed through the silence. The jury looked horrified. Even the court reporter paused. "Did Jalen have a weapon?" Nadia asked. "No." "Did Sergeant Whitaker say he had a weapon?" "Yes." "Afterwards, after the kid was unconscious," Nolan looked down at his hands. "Whitaker went to the trunk of the cruiser. He has a drop bag, a duffel bag with confiscated pieces, throw-down guns, knives. He pulled out a snub-nosed .38 revolver." Falk was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is hearsay and character assassination without a shred of physical evidence. The witness is clearly trying to save his own skin by inventing a conspiracy." "I have the evidence," Nolan shouted, his voice cracking. The room froze. Nadia Reese looked stunned. "Officer Nolan, what do you mean?" Nolan reached into his jacket pocket. "I knew who Whitaker was. Everyone knows. Before I started my shift, I bought a digital voice recorder. I taped it to the inside of my vest. I recorded everything." He held up a small black USB drive. Pandemonium erupted. Falk was screaming objections. The gallery was buzzing. Judge Crowe slammed his gavel down with the force of a blacksmith. "Order, order in this court, or I will clear the room," Crowe bellowed. When silence returned, Crowe looked at Nolan. "You have a recording of the incident?" "Yes, Your Honor, from the moment the sirens went on until the ambulance arrived." "Mr. Falk," Crowe said, his voice ice cold. "I'm going to allow this into evidence, and we are going to listen to it right now." Falk slumped into his chair. He looked at Whitaker for the first time. The mask slipped. Whitaker looked cornered. The clerk plugged the drive into the court's audio system. The audio was grainy, filled with the static of rustling fabric, but the voices were crystal clear. "Please, sir, I'm just going to choir practice." That was Jalen, his voice high with terror. "Shut your mouth, boy. You look like a dealer to me. Where's the stash?" Whitaker's voice, arrogant, slurring slightly. Then the sounds of the struggle, the sickening thwack of metal on bone, the screams, and then the silence. Then Whitaker's voice again, heavy with exertion. "Look at that. He went for my gun. Bryce, you saw it, right?" "He didn't move, Vance. You killed him." Nolan's voice, panicked. "He ain't dead yet. Now go get the .38 from the bag, unless you want to be the one explaining why a cop killer walked free. We own this town, kid. Judges, DAs, they work for us. Remember that." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a tomb. Judge Crowe removed his glasses. He looked at Vance Whitaker. The look wasn't just professional anymore. It was the look of a man seeing a rabid dog. "The jury has heard enough for today," Crowe said softly. "Bailiff, escort the jury out." As the jury filed out, many of them were openly glaring at Whitaker. The case was over. Everyone knew it. The defense was decimated. "Mr. Whitaker," Crowe said, "in light of this new evidence, specifically the admission of evidence tampering and conspiracy, I am adding federal obstruction charges to the docket. You are looking at life without parole. perhaps 2 life sentences. Whitaker stood up slowly. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at the bailiff, Raymond Voss. Voss was shaking. He had turned pale, sweat dripping down his neck. He was standing close to the defense table. Too close. "Raymond," Whitaker said softly, "it's a bad day, isn't it?" "Mr. Whitaker, sit down," Crowe commanded. "I don't think I will," Whitaker said. He turned to the gallery. He saw the hatred in their eyes. He saw his life ending. He saw a concrete cell. He made his choice. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, Vance Whitaker was a disgraced officer facing justice. The next, he was a blur of motion. He didn't lunge for the door. He lunged for Raymond Voss. Voss, paralyzed by fear and old loyalty, didn't react fast enough. Whitaker slammed a forearm into the bailiff's throat, driving him back against the railing. With practiced ease, the muscle memory of decades on the force, Whitaker ripped the service pistol from Voss's holster. "Gun!" Someone screamed from the back of the room. Chaos exploded. People scrambled under pews. The few other deputies in the room reached for their weapons, but they were too slow, and they were in terrible positions. Whitaker had a human shield. He held Voss in a chokehold, the barrel of the Glock 17 pressed tight against the bailiff's temple. "Drop it!" Whitaker roared, his voice booming over the screams. "Drop your weapons or I paint the walls with his brains!" The 2 deputies near the exit froze. They looked at Voss, their colleague, whose eyes were bulging with terror. Slowly, they placed their guns on the floor and kicked them away. "Lock the doors!" Whitaker shouted at the deputies. "Lock them now!" One of the deputies, a young woman named Deputy Higgins, hesitated. Whitaker fired a single shot into the ceiling. Dust and plaster rained down. "Now!" Higgins scrambled to bolt the heavy oak double doors. The courtroom was sealed. Whitaker shoved Voss to the floor, kicking him hard in the ribs to keep him down. He swept the gun across the room. Nobody moves. Everybody on the floor. Hands on your heads. The spectators, the lawyers, the clerk. Everyone dropped. Nadia Reese was under her table, clutching her files, trembling. Quentin Falk, the shark attorney, was cowering behind his chair, sobbing quietly. Only one person remained seated. Judge Harlan Crowe. He sat high on the bench, his hands resting calmly on the polished wood. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched when the gun went off. He watched Whitaker with a steely, terrifying calm. Whitaker turned, panting heavily. The adrenaline was flooding his system, making his vision tunnel. He walked slowly toward the center of the well, the gun trained squarely on the judge's chest. "I told you to get on the floor," Whitaker hissed. "And I told you," Crowe said, his voice steady and amplified by the strange acoustics of the room, "that this is my house." "Not anymore," Whitaker spat. "Now it's mine. You think you can judge me? You think you can sit up there in your black robe and tell me my life is over? I am the law in Oak Haven. I have been the law since before you were born." "You are a criminal, Vance," Crowe said, using the officer's first name for the first time. It was a power move, stripping away the rank. "And a coward. Holding a gun doesn't change that." Whitaker stepped closer. He was now at the foot of the bench. The distance between the barrel of the gun and the judge's heart was less than 10 feet. "You ruined everything," Whitaker said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "This was a clean shoot, a righteous bust, but you and that prosecutor, you had to make it a crusade." "You killed a child, Vance," Crowe said, his voice steady. "And now you want to kill a judge. Do you think that ends well for you? Do you think you walk out of here?" "I'm not walking out," Whitaker smiled, a twisted, manic expression. "I know that, but I'm going to take you with me. I'm going to show this town what happens when you push a good cop too far." Whitaker raised the gun higher, aiming right between Crowe's eyes. "Say your prayers, Your Honor." The room held its breath. This was it, the execution. But Judge Crowe did something that stunned everyone. He didn't beg, he didn't duck. He stood up. He stood up to his full height, looming over the bench. He looked down at the barrel of the gun with absolute disdain. "Go ahead," Crowe challenged. "Pull the trigger. Prove them right. Prove that you are exactly the monster the prosecution described. But know this, Vance." Crowe leaned forward, his eyes boring into the gunman's soul. "If you miss, if you hesitate for even a fraction of a second, I will break you." It was a bluff. It had to be. An unarmed judge against an armed, desperate man. But the sheer weight of Crowe's authority, the absolute lack of fear, made Whitaker pause. Why wasn't he scared? Why wasn't he begging? That split second of confusion was the only opening needed. The door to the judge's chambers, located directly behind the bench, creaked. It was a sound so faint only Whitaker heard it. His eyes flickered up just for a millisecond, and in that millisecond, Judge Crowe moved. He didn't dive for cover. He threw the heavy, solid oak gavel. It wasn't a clumsy throw, it was a fastball. The gavel spun through the air and struck Whitaker square in the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch. Whitaker staggered back, blinded by pain and blood, the gun discharging wildly into the floor. "Get him!" Crowe roared, vaulting over the high bench with the athleticism of a linebacker. But Whitaker wasn't done. He was tough, fueled by rage and pain. He shook off the blow, wiping blood from his eyes, and swung the gun back up toward the judge, who was now midair. The gunshot that followed was deafening. A cloud of plaster exploded from the heavy oak paneling just inches from Judge Crowe's head. He didn't flinch. He didn't pause. Gravity took over. Crowe crashed into Vance Whitaker with the force of a freight train. The impact knocked the wind out of the rogue officer, sending them both sprawling onto the hard parquet floor of the well. The gun skittered away, spinning across the floor toward the jury box. Whitaker was 50 years old, but he was brawler strong, fueled by desperation and adrenaline. He roared, driving a knee into Crowe's midsection and throwing a wild, heavy haymaker that caught the judge on the jaw. It was a hit that would have knocked a normal man cold. But Harlan Crowe wasn't a normal man. He rolled with the punch, his face grim but focused. "Get off me!" Whitaker screamed, clawing at Crowe's eyes, trying to reach for the hidden knife he kept in his boot, a backup weapon he had managed to smuggle past the lax security of his former colleagues. Crowe blocked the gouge, trapping Whitaker's wrist. Then, with a movement so fluid and technical it looked like choreography, Crowe twisted his hips and leveraged his weight. There was a sickening pop as Whitaker's shoulder was wrenched out of its socket. Whitaker howled in agony, his resistance crumbling instantly. Crowe didn't let up. He spun Whitaker onto his stomach, driving his knee into the officer's spine, pinning him to the floor. He grabbed Whitaker's good arm and wrenched it behind his back, applying a wrist lock that immobilized him completely. "Stay down!" Crowe growled, his voice guttural. "Do not move or I will snap your arm like a twig." The courtroom was frozen in shock. The deputies who had been disarmed were staring with their mouths open. Nadia Reese peered out from under her table, eyes wide. They had expected the judge to be a victim. Instead, they were watching him dismantle a trained street cop with surgical precision. "Secure the weapon," Crowe barked at Deputy Higgins, who was still paralyzed by the door. "Higgins, the gun, now." The command snapped her out of her trance. She scrambled forward, scooping up the Glock. "I have the weapon!" she yelled, training it on Whitaker. "Get the bailiff!" Crowe ordered, not releasing his grip on the sobbing, cursing officer beneath him. "Check on Raymond. Call the paramedics." Sirens were already wailing outside. The heavy doors burst open as the SWAT team, who had been staging nearby due to the high-profile nature of the trial, flooded the room. Red laser dots danced across the room, settling on the pile of bodies in the well. "Police! Drop it! Let me see hands!" the lead SWAT officer screamed. Crowe slowly raised his hands, getting off Whitaker. "He is secured," Crowe said calmly, straightening his disheveled robe. "Defendant is in custody." The SWAT team swarmed Whitaker, zip-tying his hands and ankles, dragging him up. He was bleeding from the nose, his arm hanging limp, his face a mask of snot and fury. "You're dead!" Whitaker screamed at Crowe, spitting blood onto the floor. "You think this is over? You're a dead man walking. My guys will burn this courthouse down with you in it." Crowe adjusted his glasses, which miraculously hadn't broken. He wiped a streak of blood from his lip with the back of his hand. He looked at the SWAT commander. "Commander, do not take him to the county jail," Crowe said. "He goes to federal holding, solitary, effective immediately." "You can't do that," Quentin Falk, the defense attorney, squeaked, finally emerging from behind his chair. "He needs a hospital. You assaulted my client." Crowe turned his gaze to Falk. The look was so withering the lawyer took a step back. "Mr. Falk," Crowe said, his breath steady, his pulse seemingly normal despite the life-or-death struggle. "Your client just attempted to assassinate a sitting judge and took a courtroom hostage. If you say one more word, I will have you arrested as an accomplice." Falk clamped his mouth shut. The paramedics rushed in to tend to Raymond Voss, who was groaning but alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened settled over the room. Nadia Reese walked up to the bench, looking at Crowe with a mix of awe and confusion. "Your Honor?" she stammered. How did you do that? That was Krav Maga or Jiu-Jitsu. You took down a veteran street cop in seconds." Crowe picked up his water glass and took a sip. His hand wasn't shaking. Miss Reese, Crowe said quietly, there are things about my resume that aren't on the public docket. He looked at Whitaker, who was being dragged out by 4 SWAT officers. Bring him back, Crowe said suddenly. The SWAT commander paused. Sir, I said bring him back. Stand him right there. We are finishing this proceeding. Sir, he's dangerous. He needs medical attention, the commander argued. He can wait, Crowe said, his voice hard as iron. We are on the record, and Mr. Whitaker has something to say. Don't you, Vance? Whitaker looked up, his eyes wild. He saw something in Crowe's face he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the face of a lawyer. It was the face of a predator who had finally trapped his prey. The courtroom was locked down. No one was allowed to leave. The cameras were rolling again. Vance Whitaker stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 4 heavily armed SWAT officers. He was slumped, favoring his dislocated shoulder, but his eyes were still hateful. You want to play games? Whitaker sneered. Go ahead. Throw the book at me. Life in prison? Fine. I'll run the yard in a week. You can't touch me. I know where the bodies are buried. I know about the mayor's slush fund. I know about the chief's side business. If I go down, I take this whole city with me. This was it. The threat everyone feared. The reason Whitaker had been protected for so long. Judge Crowe leaned forward. We know, Vance. Whitaker blinked. What? We know about the slush fund, Crowe said calmly. We know about the drug-skipping operation in the 9th Precinct. We know about the tampering with evidence lockers. You don't know jack, Whitaker scoffed. You're just a diversity hire in a fancy robe. Crowe smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. You asked earlier who I was, Crowe said. You said I was reading books while you were building this city. Crowe stood up and unzipped his judicial robe. Underneath, he wasn't wearing a dress shirt and tie. He was wearing a faded olive-drab t-shirt. On the left breast was a small, distinct insignia. A silence fell over the room. Before I went to law school, Crowe said, his voice carrying to the back of the room, I spent 6 years in the United States Marine Corps Force Recon. I did 3 tours in places you can't find on a map. Whitaker's eyes widened. Force Recon, the elite of the elite. That explained the takedown. That explained the lack of fear. But that's not the secret, Vance, Crowe continued, re-zipping the robe. The secret is what I did after the Marines, before I became a judge. Crowe picked up a file from his desk, a file that had been sitting there the entire trial, unopened. He opened it now. I didn't move back to Oak Haven to take care of my mother, Vance. My mother died years ago. Whitaker looked confused. Then why are you here? I was sent here, Crowe said, by the Department of Justice Organized Crime Division. A gasp ripped through the gallery. The reporters were typing furiously on their phones. I've been under deep cover for years, Crowe revealed, dropping the bombshell that stunned the court. The DOJ has been building a RICO case against the Oak Haven Police Department, but we needed a trigger. We needed someone arrogant enough, reckless enough to commit a felony in open court so we could bypass the local unions. Crowe pointed a finger at Whitaker. You weren't on trial for murder, Vance. Not really. You were the bait. Whitaker's face went pale. Bait. We knew you'd intimidate the witness, Crowe said. We knew you'd try to fix the jury, and we hoped, we prayed, that you would be arrogant enough to try something violent. Because now we don't just have you for murder, we have you for domestic terrorism. Crowe looked at the bailiff station. Officer Nolan. Bryce Nolan, the rookie who had testified, stood up. He wasn't shaking anymore. He looked calm. Officer Nolan is not a rookie, Crowe said. Special Agent Nolan is with the FBI. He's been wearing a wire for months. Every conversation in your patrol car, every bribe you took, every threat you made, it's all on tape. Not just the USB drive he played today, everything. Whitaker looked at Nolan. Nolan offered a small apologetic shrug. Gotcha, Nolan mouthed. Whitaker's legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair, the fight completely draining out of him. The ghost of the 9th was gone. In his place was a ruined old man who had walked into a trap he never saw coming. The chief of police was arrested minutes ago, Crowe announced to the stunned room. The mayor is being indicted as we speak. The blue wall has fallen, Mr. Whitaker, and you are the one who pulled it down. The gallery erupted. It wasn't fear this time. It was cheers, tears of relief. Jalen Brooks's mother stood up and screamed, "Thank you, Jesus!" Crowe banged the gavel, but there was no stopping the wave of emotion. Vance Whitaker, Crowe said, his voice cutting through the noise. You are hereby remanded to federal custody, and I suggest you start talking, because right now you are the most hated man in America and your friends in the department are going to be looking for a scapegoat." As the SWAT team hauled the broken officer away, Judge Crowe sat back down. He looked exhausted. He looked at his hands that had once held a rifle, now holding a gavel. He looked at Nadia Reese. She was smiling, tears streaming down her face. "Court is adjourned," Crowe whispered. The seasons turned in Oak Haven with a heaviness that felt almost biblical. The suffocating, sticky heat of the Louisiana summer, the backdrop for the trial that had set the city on fire, had finally broken. In its place came a wet, biting autumn. The leaves on the great oaks surrounding the courthouse didn't just turn gold. They turned the color of dried blood before withering and falling to the pavement, leaving the branches bare and skeletal against a steel-gray sky. It had been months since the day courtroom 4B had been transformed into a war zone. Months since Vance Whitaker, the self-proclaimed ghost of the Ninth, had held a Glock 17 to the head of a bailiff and threatened to execute a judge on live television. In those months, the city of Oak Haven had undergone a painful exorcism. The footage of Judge Harlan Crowe, cool, calm, and terrifyingly lethal, taking down a rogue cop had gone viral globally. But it was the aftermath that truly shook the foundations of the county. The Crowe tapes, as the media called the recordings made by rookie officer Bryce Nolan, had opened a Pandora's box. The chief of police was currently negotiating a plea deal to avoid federal prison. The mayor had resigned in disgrace, fleeing to a non-extradition country in South America before his accounts were frozen. Dozens of officers had turned in their badges. But today, the focus wasn't on the politics. It was personal. Today was about Vance Whitaker. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was different this time. During the trial, the air had been electric, charged with the friction of conflict, cop versus community, tradition versus progress. Today, the air was solemn. It was the heavy, hushed atmosphere of a funeral, or perhaps an execution. The gallery of courtroom 4B was packed to capacity, yet it was startlingly quiet. The rowdy police union supporters with their "Back the Blue" pins were gone. In their place sat the ghosts of Whitaker's past. There was Leona Brooks, Jalen's mother, wearing her Sunday best, clutching a rosary so tight her knuckles were white. Next to her sat the family of Marcus Dean, a man Whitaker had beaten into a wheelchair years ago. Behind them were shopkeepers, teenagers, and grandmothers, an entire tapestry of the community Whitaker had terrorized for decades. They weren't here to cheer. They were here to witness. "All rise!" called the new bailiff. A stern woman named Deputy Carter, Judge Harlan Crowe, emerged from his chambers. He looked exactly as he had on the day of the attack, impeccable, unreadable, a monolith in black robes. He moved with a deliberate grace, ascending the bench and arranging his files. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the gallery. He waited. "Bring out the defendant," Crowe ordered, his voice echoing off the high coffered ceiling. The side door opened, and the sound of chains, heavy, clanking steel, preceded the man himself. Vance Whitaker shuffled into the room. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. The man who entered was not the swaggering, gum-chewing bully who had sat at the defense table months ago. That man was gone. This Vance Whitaker was a ruin. He had lost at least 40 pounds. His once thick neck was scrawny, the tendons standing out like wire. His skin, deprived of sunlight in federal solitary confinement, was the color of old parchment. He wore an orange jumpsuit that seemed 3 sizes too big, and he was shackled at the ankles, waist, and wrists. He walked with a limp, a permanent reminder of the moment Judge Crowe had dislocated his hip and shoulder during the takedown. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The predator's glint, the arrogant fire that had screamed, "I am the law," was extinguished. His eyes were dull, darting nervously around the room, unable to hold anyone's gaze. He was guided to the defense table by 2 U.S. Marshals who handled him not with roughness, but with the clinical indifference one might show a sack of laundry. His new attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Klein, sat stiffly next to him, shuffling papers, clearly eager for the ordeal to be over. "Be seated," Crowe said. The room settled. The silence was absolute. "We are here for sentencing in the matter of the People versus Vance Whitaker and the corresponding federal charges pursuant to the RICO statutes," Crowe began. His voice was calm, devoid of the theatricality that lawyers usually employed. It was the voice of a man who dealt in facts. "Mr. Whitaker, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers and subsequently by federal decree of attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights." Crowe peered over his glasses. Before this court passes sentence, you are entitled to make a statement. Do you wish to do so? Klein leaned in, whispering urgently to Whitaker. Don't do it, his body language screamed. Just take it and sit down. But Whitaker shook his head. He placed his shackled hands on the table. The chains rattled, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He pushed himself up, his legs shaking. He turned not to the judge, but to the gallery. He looked at Leona Brooks. For a second, it seemed he might apologize. Whitaker's voice was a dry rasp. He cleared his throat, a wet hacking sound. I gave my life to this city. A low murmur of anger started in the back of the room, but Crowe raised a hand to silence it. I worked the night shift for decades, Whitaker continued, his voice gaining a thin, desperate strength. I went into alleys you people are too scared to drive past. I dealt with the trash. I dealt with the dealers and the gangs. And yes, sometimes you gotta be hard. Sometimes you gotta break a few eggs to keep the omelet from burning. He looked at Judge Crowe, his eyes narrowing with a flash of his old hatred. I did what I had to do. I kept order. And you sacrificed me. You threw me to the wolves to make a political point. I'm not the bad guy here. I'm the scapegoat. Whitaker slumped back into his chair, breathing hard, as if the speech had exhausted his last reserves of energy. The courtroom remained silent. It wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the silence of disbelief. Even after everything, after the tapes, the video of him pointing a gun at a judge, the testimony of his own partner, he still didn't get it. He still believed the badge made him a god. Judge Crowe looked down at Whitaker for a long, uncomfortable minute. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, Crowe said softly. Your statement has been noted, and frankly, it has made my decision significantly easier. Crowe opened the heavy leather binder in front of him. He removed a fountain pen and uncapped it, the motion precise and deliberate. You speak of order, Mr. Whitaker. You speak of cleaning up the streets, but the order you maintained was the silence of the graveyard. The safety you claimed to have provided was a protection racket enforced by fear and brutality. Crowe leaned forward, his shoulders filling out the black robe. A badge is not a license to hunt. It is a heavy burden of trust given to you by the very people you despise. When you break that trust, you do not just commit a crime against an individual. You commit a crime against the very concept of civilization. Crowe looked at Leona Brooks. For the assault on Jalen Brooks, a 17-year-old honor student who will now require care for the rest of his life due to the traumatic brain injury you inflicted with a flashlight, I sentence you to 25 years. Whitaker flinched. 25 years. He was 52. That alone was a life sentence. For the kidnapping of Deputy Raymond Voss and the hostage situation created within this courtroom, Crowe continued, his voice rising in volume, I sentence you to 30 years, to be served consecutively. Whitaker's mouth opened. He looked at his lawyer, panic finally breaking through his numbness. And finally, Crowe said, his eyes locking onto Whitaker like a target designator, for the federal charges of conspiracy and racketeering, for running a criminal enterprise from behind the shield of law enforcement, for the systemic violation of the civil rights of the citizens of Oak Haven. Crowe paused. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A sob broke out in the gallery. It was Leona Brooks. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. It was over. The boogeyman was never coming back. Furthermore, Crowe added, and this was the twist that made the blood drain from Whitaker's face, due to your background as a law enforcement officer and the high probability of your influence being used to organize within a general population, I'm submitting a binding recommendation to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. No, Whitaker whispered. Don't. You are to be remanded to the custody of the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, Crowe pronounced. You will be held in the administrative maximum unit. You will spend 23 hours a day in a soundproof concrete cell. You will have no contact with other inmates. You will have 1 hour of solitary exercise in a concrete pit. You will never see the horizon again. Whitaker surged against his chains. You can't do that, he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. That's torture. I'm a cop. You can't put me in a hole. You put this city in a hole for decades, Vance, Crowe said, his voice cold as absolute zero. It is time you learned what the dark looks like. Crowe slammed the gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot, final and irrevocable. Remand the prisoner. I'm a hero, Whitaker shrieked as the marshals hauled him up. He was weeping now, ugly, snot-filled sobs. I'm a hero. You're the traitor. You're the traitor. His screams echoed down the hallway as he was dragged out the side door, kicking and thrashing, a terrified old man facing an eternity of gray concrete. As the door slammed shut, cutting off his wails, the tension in the room snapped. It didn't erupt into cheers or applause. Instead, people stood up slowly, one by one. Leona Brooks stood. The family of Marcus Dean stood. The shopkeepers, the teachers, the mechanics. They stood in a silent, reverent ovation. They looked at Judge Crowe with tears in their eyes. It was a moment of profound shared catharsis. Crowe looked at them. For the first time in the entire trial, his stoic mask cracked. He offered a small, sad nod. Then he gathered his files, turned, and vanished into his chambers. Later that night, the moon hung low and yellow over Oak Haven. The media trucks had packed up and left. The protesters had gone home. The courthouse was a dark silhouette against the night sky, silent and empty. Inside the judge's chambers, the lights were dim. Harlan Crowe was not wearing his robe. He was dressed in dark jeans, heavy boots, and a black canvas jacket. The office, usually cluttered with case files and legal texts, was bare. The bookshelves were empty. The desk was clear, save for a single cardboard box. He picked up a framed photograph from the desk. It was an old black and white picture of a platoon of Marines standing in the red dust of a faraway land. He looked at his younger self in the photo, eyes bright, jaw set, unaware of the long, winding road that would lead him to a judge's bench in Louisiana. He placed the photo gently into the box. There was a soft knock at the door frame. Crowe didn't jump. He didn't turn around immediately. "Come in, Bryce." Bryce Nolan stepped into the room. He looked different, too. The ill-fitting suit of the rookie cop was gone. He wore a windbreaker with FBI stenciled in yellow on the back. He carried himself differently, taller, with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "The marshals have Whitaker on the transport plane," Nolan said quietly. "He's en route to Colorado. He didn't say a word the whole ride to the airfield. I think he's finally realized it's over." "It's over for him," Crowe said, sealing the cardboard box with a strip of tape. "But for this town, it's just starting." Nolan walked further into the room, looking at the empty shelves. "You really leaving, Judge? The governor wants to give you a commendation. The city council wants to name a plaza after you. You could run for mayor. Hell, you could run for Senate." Crowe chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Statues and plazas are for dead men, Bryce. And politics, that's a different kind of swamp. I'm not a politician." He turned to face the young agent. "I was sent here to do a job. The DOJ needed a wedge to crack the blue wall. We found the wedge. We swung the hammer. The job is done." "Where will you go?" Nolan asked. Crowe picked up the box. "There are a lot of Oak Havens out there, Bryce. A lot of towns where the people in charge think nobody is watching, where the judges play golf with the DA and the sheriff loses evidence when it's convenient." Crowe walked to the door, stopping next to Nolan. He looked the young man in the eye. "You did good, kid. You risked your life wearing that wire. You stood up when everyone else stayed seated. That's the hardest thing a man can do." Nolan looked down, embarrassed. I couldn't watch it anymore." "Keep watching," Crowe said intensely. "That's the trick. Never stop watching. The moment you look away, the rot comes back." Crowe patted Nolan on the shoulder, a firm, reassuring grip. Then he walked out into the hallway. Nolan followed him to the rear exit of the courthouse. A nondescript black sedan was waiting at the curb, the engine idling softly. A driver in a suit waited by the open door. Crowe tossed his box into the back seat. He paused for one last moment, looking up at the courthouse. He looked at the inscription chiseled into the limestone above the entrance, "Equal justice under law." For a long time, those words had been a lie in Oak Haven. Tonight, for the first time in years, they felt true. "Goodbye, Your Honor," Nolan said from the top of the stairs. Crowe looked back and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Not Your Honor, Bryce," he said. "Just Harlan. I'm off the clock." He got into the car. The door shut with a solid thud. The sedan pulled away from the curb, its taillights glowing red in the mist. Nolan watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared into the darkness, heading toward the highway, toward the next town, the next fight, the next impossible case. The rookie-turned agent stood alone on the steps for a moment, listening to the quiet of the city. It was a peaceful quiet. He zipped up his jacket against the autumn chill, turned, and walked back inside to start the paperwork. There was a city to rebuild, and he had work to do. And that is the incredible story of Judge Harlan Crowe and the downfall of Vance Whitaker. What started as a routine traffic stop exposed a rot that went all the way to the top of the city's leadership. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the people we trust to protect us are the ones we need protection from. But it also proves that justice can prevail when good people, like a brave rookie cop and a judge with a secret past, refuse to back down. Vance Whitaker thought he was the predator, but he picked a fight with the wrong man and ended up spending the rest of his life in a concrete box. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What do you think about Judge Crow's secret identity? Was the life sentence for Whitaker fair, or should it have been harsher? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more gripping stories like this one, make sure to hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.